lecture on a topic that is of my choice. All these topics are related to literature, but somehow or other, these topics do not find a place in our curriculum. So I have chosen those topics, and you will find these topics interesting, and they are directly related to literature. Okay, if you hear the howling of the wind outside, just ignore it, because I cannot in any way prevent the sound of the wind coming into my room. Okay, so today we will look into mythology, literature and mythology. Now that's the topic for the day. Remember, mythology or myth as we term them, they are part of our life, they are part of our literature. Now look at some of the terms which I would like to share with you. If you call someone Janus-faced, that simply means that someone has two faces and that person is hypocritical. But remember, Janus is the Roman god of doors and gates. Remember, the doors and gates, they look at two sides. One towards, let us say, there is a gate. It faces the house, then it faces the street. So, it's very interesting when you say someone is Janus-faced, that person has two faces. Look at the word Jagannath. Now, Jagannath, it simply means irresistible force that overcomes everything on its way. Actually, it refers to the car in the temple of Jagannath in Puri. That is supposed to be the biggest and perhaps a very heavy car. And whatever comes on its way, it crushes it. So we use the term Jagannath. And now, you have to move the Indian military Jagannath towards its border. That means what? Something that will crush everything on its way. Now look at this word, guardian knot. G-O-R-D-I-A-N, guardian knot. Now this is an interesting word. It is a kind of a knot, a deadlock, a problem that cannot be resolved. Suppose you find yourself in a guardian knot, means you find yourself in a deadlock. Actually, it refers to one king, Gordius of Phrygia. He tied this knot and he said, anyone who unties this knot will become the emperor of East and the Far East. Then according to the story, King Alexander the Great came in just one blow. He cut the knot into pieces, or rather, he unknotted it. So, look at words like Janus face, guardian knot, or even something like Argus-eyed. A-R-G-U-S, Argus-eyed. Now, Argus is a mythical character with 100 eyes. Suppose you say, I went for certificate verification. The one who was on the table, I would say she was Argus-eyed. Meaning what? Someone looks at something very closely, very attentively, because Argus had 100 eyes. So we use these terms in our everyday conversation. Something like Argus-eyed or Jagannath, or even you use something as simple as Adonis. That is, man, he looks like Adonis. Meaning what? Someone is very handsome, very good looking, very beautiful to look at. Adonis, you know, the goddess of love, she fell in love with Adonis. Now, look at this Venus. She fell in love with Adonis. Or look at something like Pandora's box. These words are very commonly used. Look at this word Pandora's box. Saying Zeus, the Roman god, he told Pandora in clear terms not to open the box because evil would come, all forms of evil would come out of the box. But she didn't heed to his um, words of warning. She went ahead and she opened the box and she released evils into the world. So now all the evils in the world. So we very commonly use this word, do not open the Pandora's box. Likewise, there are many such words. For instance, a word like Achilles heel. That means someone's weak spot. So everyone has weak spots, and in the case of Achilles, his leg happened to be the weak spot. So Achilles heals. So what I'm trying to say, these stories, ancient stories, myth itself means nothing but stories. So the kind of stories we say, the kind of stories we tell. So now myth also means collection of stories. Say it is a traditional story when you say that it is about heroes or even supernatural beings. And often these stories explain the origins of natural phenomena or aspects of human behavior. So, now that is myth as a word, it is used to refer to a collection of stories. Collectively, all these stories of ancient times, they can be called myth. Then what is legend? Very often we confuse these two terms, myth and legend. Legend means a story that has been passed down for generations, especially yeah. I request to put your mic under mute. Thank you. So, a legend is a story which comes from one generation to another. Please, Mr. Tamarai Selvan, may I request you to put your mic under mute? Mr. Tamarai Selvan. Tamarai Selvan.
வாட்ஸ்அப் வந்து போறதுக்கு லேட் ஆயிடுச்சுன்னு சொல்லிட்டு லிங்க் கால் பண்ணி வந்தேன். இப்ப அந்த சைடு நீ உன் வாய்ஸும் கேக்குது, அவர் பேச வாய்ஸும் கேட்குது.
தாமரை செல்வன்,
நீ பேசுறல இப்ப போன
தாமரை செல்வன்
அதுவும் கேக்குது, அங்கிட்டு அவர் பேசிட்டு எனக்கு கேக்குது இப்ப.
Right. Okay. So now look at this. Then what is legend? This is a story that we have received from the past, but it claims to be historically true. So anything that claims to be historically true, we simply call it legend, or any group of stories that we call legend. So then what is mythology? The term mythology, it simply means a body of myths, or simply it means a body of stories. So now there are people who are simply known as euhemeris. Euhemerism means this is a theory of historic origins of mythology. Well, you hear these stories. These stories were told long ago, maybe centuries and centuries before these stories were told. But according to euhemerism, it recognizes, or this theory recognizes, that mythology has its origin in history, and gods and men, they were deified as great beings, or they are deified as heroes of the past. So I'm not going into myth criticism or anything today. Then what is myth? I'll just give you two definitions, simple definitions. One given by a man like Ernest Cassirer. According to Ernest Cassirer, myth is a form of thought. Now look at it. It's a very simple definition. Myth is a form of thought. He has written a philosophy of symbolic form in which he claims myth is another symbolic form like language. Like language, any language that you speak is nothing but a symbolic form. Similarly, myth is one such symbolic form, and it is not intellectual. It's just a story. You don't require your intellect to understand a story of this kind. And it is not discursive. Above all, it is typically imagistic. So when it says it is imagistic, it is loaded with primal emotion, and it doesn't have the weightage of a language. It calls to your mind just an image when you make a reference to a mythology, and he calls it unmediated language of experience. Somehow or other, things have been handed down from one generation to another, from that generation to another, from that generation to another. We can simply take these stories as part of our past and part of our present. So, if you could understand this, this is Ernest Cassirer. Now, look at this another definition. Myth is literature. Myth is literature. Very simple definition. Myth is literature. See, how do you understand myth? Do you understand myth in literature? That is, writers who make a large scale use of myths in their creative work, or do you simply accept myth as literature? So both are possible. Myth in literature is possible. Myth as literature also possible. So I'll take you to this person that is called Jung, Carl Gustav Jung. He coined the term analytical psychology. Now, according to Carl Jung, that is, there are many things about our life, say, which he calls a collective unconscious that we have inherited racially as a group or culturally as a group. We have inherited from our forefathers and foremothers, which he calls collective unconscious, and also he uses the term racial memory. And this racial memory, which we have, of course, inherited through our language, consists of many primordial images. And for these primordial images, he uses the term archetypes. So, cultural archetypes, cultural specific archetypes. Of course, Northrop Frye, he borrows this term. These primordial images are archetypes, and he uses the term mythoi, M-Y-T-H-O-I, mythoi. And he says there is always a kind of literature or a form of literature that is related to each season. Now, before that, according to Northrop Frye, there are three things which are important. One is the solar cycle of the day, that is, a given day, one day, a solar cycle of the day. Then, the second important thing is the seasonal cycle of the year. Every year we have these seasons, at least 4 distinct seasons. We have spring, summer, autumn, and winter. So the seasonal cycle of the year, then ultimately the organic cycle of the human life itself. As a human being, we come, we live in this world, and we leave this world, which he calls the organic cycle of the human life. And he says a form of literature is suitable to each season. For instance, he says comedy, we can relate comedy with the season of spring, whereas romance with the season of summer, and tragedy with autumn, and finally irony and satire with winter. Now, this is Northrop Frye's framework, his framework of archetypes. Essentially, it means primordial images. So keep all these things at the back of your mind. With that, we will try and understand what is mythology. And there was this person, his name was Thomas Bulfinch. He was an American writer. During the middle of the 19th century, he wrote a very impressive work called The Age of Fable, which he wrote in 1855. It was published in 1855. Fables means stories. And he followed it up with another work, The Age of Chivalry, in 1858. Then the third book, Legends of Charlemagne, in 1863. In the 20th century, people collected all this. It was a very monumental task, a very impressive work by Thomas Bulfinch. It is simply called Bulfinch Mythology. This is one of my prized possessions. I would like to show you this book. This is Thomas Bulfinch Mythology, a very impressive book, a collection of myths. And of course, he has retold these myths with his own compelling style. So now I have a problem where to start. Every nation has its own mythology. We have something called Indian mythology. We have something called Japanese mythology, Chinese mythology, right? We have something called Western mythology. We have something called myths from the East or from the Middle East. Even small communities, they have their own mythic tales. And in India, myths abound. See, when people started telling tales, they started telling tales about their places. So I thought I would start with Greek mythology. And these names are very difficult to spell and pronounce. So for a change, today I'm going to make use of PowerPoint. So I'll start with the PowerPoint with the Greek mythology. Right. So we'll start with Greek mythology because that's going to be my starting point. Okay. So now, according to Greek mythology, that is, that whole thing, the world, it was called, or what we call the universe, it was called chaos. Say, when you tell a story, this is called cosmogony. That is, you tell a story about the creation or the beginning, which is called cosmogony. According to old Greek mythology, chaos is one ancient myth of creation. That is, the entire universe, it was a silent abyss. That's abyss from which all things came into existence. There was this man by name Hesiod who lived during the 8th century. Now, according to Hesiod, he gave a very impressive history of the origin of gods themselves, history of gods themselves. That is called theogony. So, beginning of the universe, that is called cosmogony. History of gods, that is called theogony. And Hesiod lived during the 8th century BC. According to him, chaos generated the solid mass of earth, and from which arose the starry cloud-filled heaven. So everything from chaos, some kind of ordering happened, and Mother Earth and Father Heaven, who were called Gaia and Uranus respectively, they were born, they were created. Originally, it was Mother Earth, Gaia. Now, you must have come across this term, Gaia, in eco-criticism and so on. And Gaia, she gave birth to Uranus. Of course, she married her own child, Uranus. They became the parents of the Titans. And the Titans, according to Greek mythology, they all inhabit the depths, the abyss. So, there are other children for chaos, and they include Tartarus and Eros. So, it began with chaos, and chaos gave birth to Gaia, and Gaia gave birth to Uranus, and Gaia and Uranus together became the parents of the Titans, and chaos, self-begetting God. You have the image of a self-begetting God. And other children of chaos include Tartarus and Eros. So this is how everything began. Then another important character was Rhea. And who is this Rhea, or who was this Rhea in Greek mythology? She is regarded as the mother of the gods. She herself was a Titan, and she was the daughter of Uranus and Gaia, heaven and earth. And their daughter was Rhea, and she was also the sister and wife of the Titan Cronus. Remember, all the Titans were children of Uranus and Gaia. So they married among themselves, and Rhea got married to Cronus. So, for many ages, Cronus and Rhea, they ruled the universe. And Cronus was warned that one of his children would seize his throne and he would become the master of the universe. And Cronus was mortally afraid of his own children. So he wanted to avert this fate or tragedy. So he did something very, very cruel. He started swallowing his offspring, his children, as soon as they were born. So now he had swallowed the first 5 children. Now Rhea was very sad. She was determined to save her 6th child, and that was the god Zeus. So she resorted to cunning. She outwitted her husband by giving him a stone wrapped in swaddling cloths. And Cronus swallowed it, thinking it was his baby. In the meantime, she had hidden her child, Zeus, and Zeus was grown. So she had hidden her child very carefully, and Cronus was not aware that one of his child had escaped. When Zeus had become fully grown, he forced his father to disgorge the stone. Fantastic story. Just carefully observe the story and look at the names so that we can remember these names. He forced his father to disgorge the stone. And all the 5 other children who had been born to Rhea, they all came out. One was Poseidon, his brother. He was god of the sea. The next one was Hades, god of the dead. So you go to the Hades, that means you go to the world of the dead. Then Demeter, she was the goddess of the earth and harvest and even fertility. That was Demeter. Then the next person was Hestia, goddess of the earth. Earth means the fire inside your home. Then the next person was Hera, goddess of marriage. Right. All were discharged by, right? Please put your mic on the mute. Thank you. So, Poseidon, Hades, Demeter, Hestia, and Hera. And Hera is incidentally goddess of marriage, and she became the wife of Zeus. So, in Roman mythology, Rhea was identified with Sibyl. Sorry, I don't have the time. Perhaps when we have the part 2 lecture, I will give you the Roman equivalents too. Now we will confine ourselves only to the Greek mythology. Now, look at it. The Greeks, what they did, they worshipped many gods. The chief among them was Zeus. I'll tell you more about Zeus. Before that, something about the Greeks' way of worshipping. And the Greeks cultivated what we call tolerance. They tolerated other gods. They tolerated diversity. And remember, the Greek culture, unlike any other culture, recognized diversity, and there was nothing called single truth or code. Every Greek city, they had its own gods. Say, like here we have in India, you go into any small town or village, you will find a temple dedicated to some god or even deity. And for that god or deity, there is always a history. We simply call that Sthala Purana. See, our Idihasas and Puranas, they are full of such stories. Apart from this Sthala Purana, what we call the story of the place and the story of the guardian of that place, maybe a god or a goddess. Similarly, the Romans and the Greeks, they had their city-states, and every city-state was well protected by a god or goddess, and for them, there were stories. Right, in one of my earlier lectures, I told you about the stories, right, which were enacted, and nearly 15,000 people are so gathered. They had these tragedies, and they told the stories of their gods and goddesses. Then they had the satire plays. Then they had their comedies. So they told such stories. Okay, now listen carefully. And the Greek mythology was like a complex and rich language. There are thousands and thousands of gods. But I will confine myself to Zeus, the god of the sky, and the ruler of the Olympian gods. See, according to Homer, he was the father of gods and mortals. And of course, he did not create either gods or mortals, but he was their father in the sense of being the protector and ruler both of the Olympian family and of the human race. He was the lord of the sky, the rain god, and the cloud gatherer. See, now if you look at Vedic gods, and sometimes you come across such gods. For example, the Maruts are the gods of clouds, Marut. Then Indra, god of thunder. Okay, So, and similarly, you had someone like Zeus who wielded the terrible thunderbolt, and he had this breastplate called Aegis, and his bird, the eagle. Now, look at the gods. Say, look at the Tamil god, Lord Muruga. He has his own bird, namely the peacock. So, look at him. His breastplate was the Aegis, his bird, the eagle, then his tree, the oak tree. And where did Zeus live? He lived on a mountain top, on Mount Olympus in Thessaly. Thessaly is in Greece. Saying the mountains are regarded as the abodes of God. See, we have something like in our own culture, in our own myth, you have Mount Kailash, for instance, the abode of Lord Shiva. Then you had all the mountains in our country. They are all abodes of gods. So you will find a lot of similarities, but the similarities end there. Now, Zeus is described as falling in love with one woman after another. The woman would be either a goddess or a human being. And he resorted to all kinds of tricks to hide his infidelity from his wife. His wife's name is Hera, if you remember that. And stories of his escapades, his sexual escapades, were numerous in ancient mythology. And many of these gods and goddesses were the result of his offspring. And because of his love affairs with goddesses and mortal women. So, later day Greeks, they somehow or other wanted to create a god who would be known for his ethical life. Because a god who was hedonist and who had multiple affairs, well, it's not, it didn't sound very ethical. So, when later day Greeks, they started explaining the multiple affairs of Zeus as nothing but people's attempt to create a lineage to the father of gods. Say, even in India, many royal families, they call themselves Agniputra or Brahmaputra, right? Right? They even Suryaputra and things like that. They try to trace their lineage to gods. And similarly, the Greeks did it. And the later the Greek scholars, they simply said this was just an attempt to create such a rich lineage. Now, we'll start with a few affairs of Zeus and the children that were born to him. Now, there is a character called Leto. She is a daughter of the Titans Phoebe and Coeus. And remember, she was the mother of divine twins. One is Artemis, and Artemis, remember, she is the goddess of the bow and of hunting. I think Artemis is called Diana in Roman mythology. And other god is Apollo. And Apollo happens to be god of prophecy, medicine, and archery. And Artemis and Apollo, they were born to Zeus, they were twins, and they were the children of Zeus and Leda. And Zeus was their father. So, but Leto had a problem. When she was about to give birth to the twins, Zeus banished her because he was afraid of the jealousy of his wife, Hera. And the time for delivery had come. And Leto, she had to move around requesting countries and islands to give her some form of refuge. Finally, after her wanderings, she set foot on a small island floating in the Aegean Sea. This Aegean Sea is closer to modern-day Greece. And there was this small island called Delos. It was a rocky, barren place. And when Leto reached it, and when she asked for refuge, she was immediately granted refuge and she was welcomed hospitably. And at that moment, four great pillars, they rose from the bottom of the sea to hold the island firmly and moved forever after. Beautiful story, and this is where Leto gave birth to Artemis and Apollo. And Artemis and Apollo were the children of Zeus. Now, this is another affair of Zeus. Right. Now, why am I talking only about Zeus? All these became very, very attractive for the writers when the Renaissance happened in England. They took to writing poetry, very rich poetry. They took to writing plays. Most of the plays and poems were all about Greek mythology. Perhaps in the next class, in part 2, I'll make references to that, you will understand. Right, now we will look at Zeus and Demeter. And Demeter in Greek mythology is goddess of grain and the harvest. And she was the daughter of the Titans, Cronus and Rhea. Of course, Zeus forced his father to disgorge and Demeter came out. And of course, Demeter and Zeus, they had this affair. And they had a daughter, her name was Persephone. And she was born to Zeus and Demeter. But she was abducted by Hades, god of the underworld or god of the dead. And Demeter was heartbroken. She was filled with grief. And her grief was so great, she neglected the land. And plants stopped growing and famine devastated the earth. And dismayed at this situation, what Zeus did was, of course, Zeus was the ruler of the universe. He demanded that his brother Hades return Persephone to her mother. After a lot of persuasion and threat, Hades agreed. Now, Hades agreed to return Persephone, but before that, he made her eat some pomegranate seeds. Now, this would force her to return to him for 4 months each year. And Persephone returned, and Demeter was overjoyed. She was overjoyed to see her daughter with her. And Demeter caused the earth to bring forth bright spring flowers, the spring season, and abundant fruit and grain for the harvest. But however, her sorrow returned each fall when Persephone had to go back to the underworld. She would return to the underworld for 4 months, whereas she would remain here only for 8 months. So, the desolation of the winter season and the death of vegetation were regarded as the yearly or annual manifestation of Demeter's grief. So, this is another beautiful story, Zeus and Demeter. Now, Zeus had an affair with a mortal woman. Her name is Leda. Now, Leda in Greek mythology happened to be the wife of one Tyndareus, who was king of Sparta. Now, Tyndareus was a mortal. He was a human being. And Leda was a human being. And Zeus started wooing Leda in the form of a swan. This story is written as a poem by D.E.Benet, Leda and the Swan, which we will see in the next class. Now, look at this. And Leda, she gave birth. And remember, she became the mother of 4 children, Castor and Pollux. Now, Polydeuces is also known as Pollux, Castor and Pollux, Clytemnestra, and Helen of Troy. So, After the god Zeus had wooed Leda in the guise of a swan, she laid two eggs. From one egg were hatched Pollux and Helen. They were immortal children of Zeus. And from the other egg were hatched Castor and Clytemnestra, who were mortal children of Tyndarus. Look at this story. Fantastic story, right? An earthly woman giving birth children, one children of God Zeus and children of man Tyndarus. That is why Helen has this, Helen becomes an immortal being. Remember the story of Dr. Faustus, who wants Helen to be brought to him so that he can have a happy time with her? Because Helen is immortal, according to the Greek story. Now, who is this Clytemnestra? You will come across Clytemnestra later, say another Greek general. We'll talk about Clytemnestra. She dies. Later, she kills her own husband, right, and so on. I will take up the stories in part 2. Now, listen carefully. And where did Zeus live? Zeus lived on Mount Olympus. Now, Mount Olympus, even now, it stands in northern Greece. It is the loftiest point in Greece, and this is on the boundary between Thessalia and Macedonia, that is near the Aegean Sea. Now, in early Greek mythology, it was believed to have been the home of at least a dozen of gods. On its summit, that is on the top of the mountain, were the palaces of gods, and they were built by Hephaestus. And Hephaestus was a god of metal work. And in fact, Hephaestus, he used to limp. His leg was partly damaged. I'll tell you more about Hephaestus a little later. And the entrance to Olympus was through a gate of clouds. And you cannot, because the clouds always hang on top of Mount Olympus. If you want to enter the summit, you have to pass through a gate of clouds protected by the seasons. And Zeus had a throne on Olympus, and the gods there feasted on nectar and ambrosia. And they were serenaded by the muses. The muses would sing endlessly, song after song, making their god happy. So, Mount Olympus is the abode of Zeus. As I told you, there were 12 major Olympian deities. One is this pair, Zeus and his wife Hera. Then his brothers, I already told you about Poseidon, god of the sea, Hades, god of the underworld. Then his sister Hestia, goddess of the earth, and his children, that is, children of Zeus, Athena, also known as Minerva in Roman mythology, goddess of wisdom, Ares, god of war, Apollo, god of the sun, Artemis, goddess of the moon and of the hunt, Aphrodite, goddess of love, Hermes, messenger of the gods, and of course, Hephaestus. So, now look at this. Zeus and his wife, Hera, his brothers, then his sister, and all his children, they all lived on top of Mount Olympus, a very sacred place for the gods. And the muses, they were also there on mountain top, serenading him. So, now who are these muses? Now, muses, they are an interesting category. There are 9 goddesses. They all happen to be daughters of the god Zeus, king of the gods, and his wife Mnemosyne. Now, Mnemosyne herself is a goddess. She is not a mortal being like Leda. She was a goddess. Now, she is a goddess of memory. Remember, very often we talk about mnemonic devices. The word mnemonic has its roots in this Roman goddess Mnemosyne. And together they had 9 daughters. And the muses were believed to inspire all artists, especially poets, philosophers, and musicians. So, by the time we reach the 3rd century to 5th century, the Romans came to believe that each muse would preside over a particular art. Now, look at Calliope. She was the muse of epic poetry. If you want to write an epic, you have to invoke the blessings of Calliope. And any poet, say, in those days, people believed in the concept of divine afflatus. Now, what is this divine afflatus? You are inspired by the divine to write something. A human being on his own or on her own cannot write. You need the gods to inspire you. In fact, because of this inspiration, you would produce rich poetry or rich drama and so on. So Calliope was the muse of epic poetry and Clio of history. Then Euterpe of lyric poetry. And remember, in those days, this lyric poetry was sung to the accompaniment of the flute. So if you want to write lyric poetry, it has to be musical so that it can be set to music. And whose blessings you have to invoke? You have to invoke the blessings of Euterpe. Then Melpomene, another daughter of theirs, she was the muse of tragedy. Then Terpsichore, she was the muse of choral songs and the dance. So choral songs, they were composed and people would join together and they would tap their feet and they would dance. Terpsichore. And Erato, another daughter, was the muse of love poetry. And look at this. Poetry has to be accompanied by a musical instrument. And if you write love poetry, and love poetry has to be sung to the accompaniment of the lyre, a beautiful musical instrument. And polyhymnia is the muse for sacred poetry. So even the Christians use the term hymns for sacred poetry, what they sing inside church. The word hymn is used. Then Urania is goddess of astronomy and Thalia of comedy. So these 9 daughters live with their parents on Mount Olympus, and this is so beautiful. The muses are said to be inspirational for many a writer. Then who else occupied Mount Olympus? Right? There were others. And remember these Furies. Right, now you come back with the Furies. The Furies are spread over the world. And according to Greek mythology, they are the avenging deities. They would take vengeance, even if a human being is not vengeful, even if a human being is not hateful, the Furies would have their vengeance. So whatever crime you do, whatever evil you do, you have a price to pay. The Furies will not spare you. The Furies will follow you till they have their vengeance, till they avenge the wrong deed. So, Tisiphone is the avenger of murder. And Megara, she avenges the jealous one. Do not become jealous of others. Be careful. And you have to be extremely cautious. Do not allow jealousy to rule your heart, because jealousy will destroy you. Megara. And remember that poem? The Poison Tree by William Blake, how jealousy consumes one. Megara is active. Then the next one is Alecto. Alecto, that is, human beings commit evil or crime because they do not have control over their anger. They do not know anger management. As a result, they commit evil. So, the Furies are also known as Aryan Eyes, and they are the daughters of Uranus and Gaia. Sometimes they are called the daughters of night. And where did they live? They live in the world below, and they would ascend to earth to pursue the wicked. They were just merciless. They punished all offenses. So, and how these goddesses are pictured, I think I showed you the title of the book, Bullfinch Mythology. You must have seen that on the cover page, the picture of the Furies. And the Furies are terrible goddesses. And they had snakes for hair. They would climb, ascend to earth, the snakes, like the snakes which remain deeply burrowed in the earth, then they would ascend. Likewise, the Furies would also ascend, and they had snakes for hair and blood dripped from their eyes. They tormented the wrongdoers and pursued them from place to place across the earth, driving them mad. Till they destroyed them, the Furies would not rest. Interesting. I'm not going to do a lot of dumping today. All right. I will just focus your attention on muses and the early Roman gods and goddesses, because these names and these characters names are repeated in poetry and drama and in fiction, saying there is something called illusionary effect. I call this illusionary effect. Now, what is this illusionary effect? Many a writer makes an allusion to these figures. Say, when we talk about neoclassical age, when Pope and others, they all started translating works by Homer, by Virgil, right? Then other great writers of the classical times. And they started using these names of the gods and the legendary figures in the work. So every time when you look at read a piece of work, because it is literature elegantly written with some kind of reference. If you really want to understand a piece of literature, right, you need to know what these references are to. Say, when someone writes literature in our country, when someone makes a reference to Kannagi, we understand. When someone makes a reference to the Raja Harishchandra, we understand. Or someone makes a reference to Lord Rama, or when someone makes a reference to Kaigeyi or Kuni or Shaguni, we understand. Or even to Narada, we understand. How? Because we already have an a priori knowledge of our Indian stories, our Idihasas and Puranas. We know the story. We know our epics. So the great epics, like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, they are all about these figures, these archetypes, the cultural archetypes. So if you really want to understand English literature or French literature or any Western literature, you need to have some knowledge of this Greek mythology so that you can understand. Now, look at this. These muses whom we saw, they were said to be the companions of the Graces and of Apollo, the god of music. They all sat near the throne of Zeus and sang songs of his greatness and of the origin of the world and its inhabitants and the glorious deeds of great heroes. So the muses were worshipped throughout ancient Greece. Next, we will look at who these graces were. We saw the muses, the Furies. Now we'll take a look at the graces. The graces are Greek goddesses. So in Greek mythology, there are three goddesses of grace. They are namely joy, charm, and beauty. And who are they? They are also daughters of the god Zeus and the nymph Eurynome. Now, Zeus and the nymph Eurynome. Now, look at it. I told you, Zeus had multiple affairs with goddesses and mortal women. So, but this is a nymph. So, and these graces were named Aglaia. Aglaia means splendor. Euphrosyne, that means mirth, that is full of laughter and joy. Right? And Thalia, good cheer. Say, this Thalia is different from the muse Thalia, who is the muse for comedy. But look at the name Thalia, that is used for happiness, joy. Here it is good cheer. And the graces presided over banquet, dances, and all pleasurable social events. They brought joy and goodwill to both gods and mortals. Saying the graces, look at the word grace itself. And they were the special attendants of the divinities of love, Aphrodite, and Eros. And along with the muses, they sang to the gods on Mount Olympus. And they danced to beautiful music that god Apollo produced on his lyre. In some legends, look at that, Aglaia was wed to Hephaestus. Now, he was the craftsman among the gods, and it was he who protected, along with the seasons, Mount Olympus, and it was he who built the palace on top of Mount Olympus, according to the traditional story. So, these graces, they were believed to endow artists and poets with the ability to create beautiful works of art. If you want to be a sculptor, good, you have to, because if you have to seek the help of the graces. And if you want to be a good potter, seek the help of the graces. So, now these graces were not seen as one separate from the other. They were not treated as individuals, but as a kind of a triple embodiment of grace and beauty. All three in one. They are a kind of a trinity. So, in art, they are usually represented as young maidens dancing in a circle. Now, Aglaia, splendor, Euphrosyne, mirth, and Thalia, good cheer. The graces. We are seeing the muses, the Furies, the graces. Look at the last one, the fates. Say, recently, when Mr. Amitabh Bachchan was in quarantine, he said it is difficult to overcome the fates. I was wondering whether he was referring to Greek mythology or our Indian concept of fate, right? That is life's destiny. Saying we have to face our destiny. Many people are fatalistic, but some people are not. And we have even a saying in Tamil, we can overcome our fate with the help of our mind, right? Vidhiye Madhya Vellalam. But it is this inexorable march. Inexorable march means when the sun rises in the morning, it will travel across the sky and finally it will set. Right? In no way you can stop the marching of sun. Fate is something similar to that. You cannot stop something from happening. This is one kind of belief. In Greek mythology, there were again three goddesses who were determined uh, to control human life and destiny. And they were known as Moirae in Greek and Parque in Latin. So Moirae and Parque say, and now, right from the beginning of a human being's birth, the fates had a portion given each at birth itself a share of good and evil. Now, we may add good or evil in due course of our life, but very often we increase the evil by our stupidity, by our foolishness. In art and poetry, they appear as stern old women or as somber maidens. They are not very beautiful to look at. They are not good to look at. They look very grim. They look very serious. And they were often thought of as weavers, right? They spin. Then the thread of life, it is believed they are weavers. And, when the weavers spin, it is nothing but the thread of life. Metaphorically told, one of the fates is named Clotho, Clotho. The other one is Lachesis, Lachesis, that is the dispenser of lots. That is, you throw lots, whatever comes to you, you are fated to be that. Then the next one is Atropos, right? And Atropos carried the shears. So shears, right, maybe when we use these shears to cut the hair or to trim and prune the plants. So Atropos carried the shears and cut the thread of life at the appointed time. So Clotho spins the thread of life, right? And Lachesis decides how it is spun, and Atropos, using the dreaded shears, cuts the thread. And look at the last line. The decisions of the fates cannot be altered, even by the gods. Gods cannot intervene. So that is why the whole concept of fates. Now look at this. Now I have given you a list, the kind of affairs that Zeus had. Now on the left you find, say, the mother of, that is Zeus' paramour, right, or wife, and the offspring. With the Demeter, he had Persephone. With the Dione, he had Aphrodite. With the Eurynome, he had the three graces. With the Hera, I have given you the names: Eris, Eileithyia, Hebe, and Hephaestus. Then with Leto, he had Apollo and Artemis. Then with Maia, Hermes. Meting is an interesting person. I'll tell you when I talk about Athena or Minerva. Then with the Mnemosyne, he had these muses. And with Themis, he had the seasons and Morae, the fates. So now this is what we call theogony, the origin of gods. Saying Hesiod, he wrote this theogony or genealogy of the gods. This he had written in the 8th century, and somewhere around the 2nd century, there was a man called Apollodorus. And Apollodorus, he was a mythographer, and he wrote this, what we call the library. And this he wrote in the 2nd century BC. So in the 2nd century BC, he wrote this, and he was a very impressive writer. He had collected all these stories. He had collected all these beautiful stories during the 2nd century BC. And remember, as I told you earlier, when he wrote this, he had this in his mind to order the thousands and thousands of offsprings of God. See, in India we say 33 crore gods, right? 33 crore gods, and hardly we know the story of some 50 gods or 100 gods. 33 crore gods. And how do we know the stories of these gods? We have to go to the respective places. You go to a small village near Madurai, someone will tell you the story of the god or goddesses or the preceding deity of that town. So, now why are these things important? These things are important because they facilitate our understanding of a text. Okay, so now in the beginning, when I started my lecture, I told you about Carl Jung. And when Carl Jung talked about primordial images, so when he talked about the primordial images, he said they were the archetypes or primordial images. And he went on to say, um, these primordial images find expression in characteristic forms. Mark these words. I will read out that. I don't want to make a mistake. Let me read out. Here. He says, these primordial images find expression in characteristic forms in the form of Earth Mother, Gaia, Earth Mother, the divine child. So another archetype, the wise old man. You come across a wise old man. Then the sacrificial death of the god, or even man, animal, monster. I'll tell you more about the satyr, Pan, gods like them. Now one is half human and half goat, Pan, right? Or satyr, who is half horse and half human. So now they all find such expressions. Then he also talks about the number 4. Now what is this significance of number? I have heard of number mysticism, but very often in Tamil we always say 4. Namakku 4 பேர் வேணும், நறுக்குன்னு 4 வார்த்தை, 4 பேர்கிட்ட சொல்லணும். I was wondering what it was, right? So, I didn't know exactly, what do you mean by this 4? Very often people say, it is your Mata, Pita, Guru, Dev, these 4, right? Or even 4 people to carry your dead body. I do not know, right? So, but when I went and made a search of my own, I came across some interesting find. I didn't copy it from any book. This was a discovery of my own. But you can talk to other elders and you can seek clarification. I am yet to seek clarification. Look at this. The Vedas were 4 in number. So after reading Carl Jung, I made this small, exploration. Vedas were 4 in number, right? Rig, Yajur, Sama, and Atharva. 4 Vedas, right? Then, of course, what I told you a little early, Mata, Pita, Guru, Dev. 4. Then there are 4 stages of life. Brahmacharya, Grihaprastha, Vanaprastha, and Sannyasa. 4 stages of life, very clear. And Indian philosophy makes it very clear. 4 stages: Brahmacharya, Grihaprastha, Vanaprastha, Sannyasa. 4. Okay. Then, if you really want to be a perfect man, a Mahapurush, someone, you have to seek 4 things in life: Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. 4. Dharma, your action, right? Arth, wealth, Kama, pleasure, and Moksha. 4. Okay. Then, even in Manusmriti, when they divided people on caste lines into 4 major groups: the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. 4. Then, when they divided time also in Indian philosophy, it is Kreta, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali. Kreta, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali. Okay, so now I do not know, no one explains to me this concept of number 4, but Carl Jung makes it a point. I do not know what he is exactly referring to, number 4. But here we have always seen 3. The fans, the Furies, the Grazers, and others, they are always 3 in number. I do not know the significance of this number. It is up to you to go and search, and you have to find. Okay, the seasons are also 4 according to someone. So go and find out what the significance of number 4 is. So it makes an interesting read. Now, when you turn towards mythology, when you start learning mythology, it facilitates your understanding, number 1. Number 2, you understand what the writer is writing. Otherwise, you cannot proceed from one line to another if you do not have. That is why in good old days, they introduced something called annotated text. Now, annotated text. Why we went for annotated text? You can have a quick and immediate reference of the material at hand, especially when they refer to mythology. You have no knowledge of mythology, or we have no knowledge of mythology, so that we can understand and proceed with the text. So as students of literature, we need to have some understanding of these mythical figures. Say myth criticism, sometimes people say, right? Now, we talk about the ancient myths, but remember, people create new myths. Whenever a writer writes something, when the writer creates a character or a thought or even an idea, say the writer is indulging in what we call a mythopoeic effort. The writer is undertaking a mythopoeic effort. It is called mythopia. See, now mythopia is nothing but creating a myth. I'll give you one example. With that, I will close. Look at J.K. Rowling. She has created stories. At least she has written 7 great works. Harry Potter series. She has created 2 worlds. The normal world in which we live, then the magical world. And she has created certain characters, say, like shapeshifters, people who can change their shape, like the ancient gods can change their shape. She was greatly influenced by Greek mythology and Western mythology. Say, Zeus could transform himself into a swan, and he could woo Leto. In the form of a swan, he goes and mates with her and produces a child. You become a shapeshifter. Gods become shapeshifters. Fine. That's what you find in J.K. Rowling. Then, invisibility cloak. Someone puts on an invisibility cloak. You put on that invisibility cloak, no one can see you. No one can observe you because you live in a world of magic. So, now look at all this. Right. Now, when you create a new world, a new myth, right? J.R.R. Tolkien, say, I think Tolkien was the first person to talk about this mythopoeic effort. When he created The Hobbit, well, he created a new myth, say, excuse me, or the writers who followed him, even C.S. Lewis, he created a different kind of myth. Say, these are all modern day myths. So don't think myths means they must be stories from good old days or from ancient times. Okay. Now, where is the difference between mythopoeia and legendarium? See, legends are larger than life images. Say, legend, you can be a legend in your own lifetime. See, people talked about N.T.R. being a legend because he was a legendary figure in the film world Then he could straddle film and politics very easily. And Miss Jayalalitha herself was a great legendary figure. See, people who transcend their limits and prove themselves elsewhere. So now we talk of such people as legends or legendary figures, even in our own times. But legend, as I told you in the beginning, let me say whether I have this definition with me, right? A story that has been passed from one generation to another, especially one that is presented as history, but is unlikely to be true. It may not be true. This is the original definition of a legend. Say, for instance, King Arthur is a legend. When did King Arthur live? But the English people claim King Arthur happened to be an English character, and his round table of knights, his Camelot. When did they live? They said in distant history. In distant history. They are all legends because they were all mortals, they were not gods. He was a king and he died. He had a wife, right? And even his wife had an affair with another fellow knight. She was a human being, right? So now look at all this, but legendary figures. Charlemagne's story. The French had their own Charlemagne story. They are all legends. Perhaps there were some people by name King Arthur, maybe a Bretwalda, an ordinary king who lived there, and they become larger than life, larger than life. So now, life of such people we call legends, and we create this legendarium, right? Larger than life image. They must have been very courageous, honor bound. They were all people who were given to uh, great virtues or warrior qualities, pride and things like that. But they are legends. So, as I told you in the beginning, I think in the beginning I made this distinction between myth and legend, and the whole idea, the whole concept of mythology, I have presented before you Greek mythology. So, when we return next week, I'll go for part 2. I'll tell you stories. Meanwhile, you explore Indian mythology. And there are lots and lots of Indian mythological figures. And I also told you about this number 4, right? About from Indian philosophy. Think over that and find out what is so significant about each myth or mythology. Say, when we talk about these archetypes, cultural archetypes, we draw material from mythology. We get all these myths, say, and people create new myths. Say, they become part of our memory. Say, some time ago, I think, I do not know how many of you have seen Star Wars films. Now, in all the Star Wars films, you come across Darth Vader, the character, Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia. I'll tell you more about these modern day mythologies. Hollywood has created a mythology about space travel, about space life, Star Wars, right? Star Trek. They have created. These are all modern day mythologies. So, interplanetary travel, interplanetary communication, interplanetary movement, trade, things like that. And to add to that, they have brought a fantasy and science and technology together. So, and they are creating new myths, say, and these myths may be relevant to our own times. And 200 years from now on, when people look back at 20th century or 21st century, they will be talking about the myths that we had created. Okay, so people, you want to know about aboriginal myth or the mythology of the Maoris or the Aborigines. I'll be certainly spending some time on that when you have the next lecture, that is part 2 on mythology, because just an hour and a half is not sufficient to talk about mythology. In some universities in the US, they study mythology for one full semester, right? So, and I'm trying to tell you in just an hour and a half. This is introductory in nature. All these classes are introductory in nature, and I'll tell you more about this myths and mythology. Right. Now, right, as someone points out, by trying to understand these mythologies, we'll understand the truth about our universe. Right. Everything comes to us in the form of story. The point is that, say, even stories, your religious beliefs, your religious faith, everything comes to you in the form of a story. So, myth is literature, myth is a thought, myth is a story, grand stories. They are grand tales. So, yes, you are right. We try to understand the universe through these stories. So, now, only with the help of these stories, we are able to remember things. Say, we are able to, with the help of our memory, we are able to relate one with another. So, the originary stories, for instance, the Christians, the Muslims, and the Hindus, they believe in the same story. The Garden of God created the world, and how God created Garden of Eden. All these three Abrahamic religions, they believe in this story, right? So, and Milton, by writing Paradise Lost, he has simply exalted this story to a greater level, and he has helped us to understand. But look at the same Milton. When he started writing this story, do you know who Milton's muse was? Not Jesus Christ, not God the Father. It was Uranus, right? Urania, right? The celestial god, right? The Greek god, the god whom he invoked when he wrote his um, um, Paradise Lost was a Greek god. Okay, it's all interesting. So continue to attend these lectures, and uh, before I close,